Let's see if this works. It seems to work.
It does actually.
Do you want a mic also, or are we just going to talk using our voices?
I mean, I probably need a mic, seeing
You
as I'm
probably
the
need a
quiet one.
Yeah, is it on?
Yeah, it's on.
It's not
Nope.
very
Smooth toes,
Yeah.
fox and dragon.
How about this?
There you go.
Yeah, that's like talking to it.
So good morning. Welcome to the panel on writing fantasies. No, wait, fantasy. Right. I shouldn't mix those two up.
Yeah.
That was last night.
Fantasies is probably,
I'm Kyell Gold. I have written some fantasy novels in my time.
I'm JD Drakis, most often go by JD. In terms of publication, fantasy, I have a story in the upcoming Swordmasters from Armored Fox Press, whenever that comes out. I also have a lot of stuff online, mostly in the Elder Scrolls Fantasy universe.
Cool. So, I think the way we're going to do this is we're just going to sort of talk back and forth about fantasy writing and reading for a little bit, and then as you guys have questions, usually we end up talking about 20 minutes and then opening up to questions, and we want to make sure that if you guys came here with specific things you wanted us to talk about, that we get a chance to talk about them. So, think about questions you guys have now, come up with questions while we're talking, and then we will have a fun discussion afterwards. So, where do you want to start? What is sort of your model for fantasy these days? Okay, that was a tough question. Let me backtrack on that one. What is a fantasy book that you've read in the last 2 years that you thought was exceptional and took fantasy in a different direction than you had thought?
Gosh. Last thing I can, well, I'm a classic fantasy guy, so a lot of Tolkien, Terry Brooks, that sort of thing. Which,
Bless you.
Sorry.
actually Terry Brooks was the last one that I can remember. Running with the Demon, where he brought it into kind of a modern world with a lot of fantasy elements into it. And did other things with it, but I have opinions on those, which... And that's really the thing that comes to mind to begin with. How about you?
So, the last, man, I'm a huge fan of Nora Jemison's Broken Earth series. 5th season, Obelisk Gate, Stone Sky, which are, I think, technically science fiction, but also you have people wandering around them with more or less magic powers. So I think it has a lot of elements of fantasy. It's very much like in that respect, like the Dragon Riders of Pern series, which is, technically science fiction because it takes place on an alien planet, and these dragons are just alien life forms that were kind of bred up by the colonists or whatever. But it's a fantasy story, really. She's not kidding anyone. It's a fantasy story about people who live in ancient extinct volcanoes and ride dragons around. In the same way, the Broken Earth series is about a race of people who have the ability to affect, I'm not quite sure how to say it, the gravity, basically. They can cause tectonic activity, they can tap into geothermal energy, and do all kinds of things with that. And they've been more or less enslaved for their power, even though they have all this power and theoretically could take over the world. So it's a great trilogy. She does a fantastic job building up the world. It's a unique world, and it has a history. She examines all kinds of societal ramifications, and it has one of the strong elements of fantasy, which is an idea of a strong idea of morality within the story. And fantasy worlds often have these questions of not just good versus evil, but the question of what is right and wrong. And a lot of these, in science fiction books you'll have this, but more often in science fiction stories, it's linked around a certain idea, like is the application of this idea right or is it wrong? Like if we develop this new technology, what would be the right way to use it? How would people react to it? And a lot of times it's just explorations of what would happen when this new idea came around. Fantasy worlds tend to be much more about larger questions of morality as applied to society, as applied to civilizations and communities. And I think in that respect, the Broken Earth series qualifies as more fantasy than science fiction, because it's not examining, in a sense it's examining what if you had this race of people, how would society respond to that? But it's also asking the questions of, in a larger sense, how we treat people who are different from us and who maybe we're afraid of because of their inherent abilities.
Yeah, that does drop into. The other thing I find that fantasy is for me is the presence of magic, although when I run as far away from that as possible when I personally read or write.
So why is that?
I don't know.
I have struggled with magic. I have a current fantasy series that is, out down in the dealer's room right now. Second book just came out, which takes place in a Revolutionary War era colonial America around a magic school. And the first book took me like 7 years to get done. And part of that was getting the magic system right, because I have an engineering background, and so when I follow my instincts about magic, it's all very, very regimented and organized, and it's very much like the D&D system that I grew up with, where you have 12 mana points. Would you like to cast Fireball? That costs 2 mana points. It will take you 2 hours to recover 2 mana points. Fireballs will do 3d6 damage to this area right here, and this is how all of this works. And that really appealed to me as an engineer, because I like having the, when I pull this energy and convert this energy into this other energy and put it in that place, it does this thing, and that's all very exact. But that wasn't magical to me. That was like science, and I didn't want my magic to be science. And it was actually, my magic system is probably most modeled after the Harry Potter magic system, which also bugs me for several reasons that you can find well documented online if you Google problems with Harry Potter magic system. And I agree with many of them, but I wanted magic to be more fluid and less technical. And so it took me a while to come up with something, but then the problem with that is because, I'm an engineer, now I have this thing in my world that doesn't have rules, or that has rules, but they're very vague rules, and they're kind of based more around whatever. And the thing that I think Harry Potter's magic system does, and she rarely explicitly dives into this part of it, is it's very much dependent on the will of the magician. And Rowling mentions it in, I think, the 6th Harry Potter book, when I'm not. Your spoiler deadline is way past the Harry Potter series. When Harry tries to throw one of the unforgivable curses at Snape and fails, and Snape says, "You have to mean it." And she never explicitly goes into what that means in the larger sense, but the idea that your will is really important in casting a spell really appealed to me, and so that's something that I incorporated into my magic system, but again, trying not to make it super explicit, trying to just say, you learn this series of syllables, which serves as a mnemonic to remind you to associate what it feels like to do this thing. And one of the things that my main character does, because he's the first fox person to ever try magic, is he realizes that he can use his sense of smell, because smell has such strong associations with him, to help him make associations and cast spells. So that's sort of my journey with magic. I don't know if that sparked anything for you
Maybe. Speak. I know. I told you I'm the quiet one. But
There's only two of us, so suck it up.
to. I know.
you always notice how writers gather in your own personal peanut gallery. But yeah, I'm magic. See, that's the thing, is that they tend to gather in these organizations that are very stoogey and rules-based, and which they kind of have to, seeing with what they're dealing with, but I think that's what doesn't appeal to me. I tend to gravitate more towards people who live in a fantasy world and survive by their own skills, going back to D&D, rangers, thieves, rogues, that sort of thing. And that's kind of where I hang out, in the shadows, as the quiet one.
So is one of the appeals of the fantasy world for you? I'm going to force you to answer questions now. That's how you're going to talk if we're going to do this. So is one of the appeals of the fantasy world for you that it is a more open society, a more free society, where you can kind of hang around in the margins and make your own way, which is more difficult to do in a contemporary civilized world where, like, there's so many demands on you that you can't really skirt around the edges as much?
I think that's part of it. There was a thought and then it's gone.
Someone stole it.
Yes, someone stole it. That those kinds of people can also be successful and seem as positive, whereas in contemporary, they're always kind of seen in a negative light. I think that's the big thing.
So so it's not just, so when you're talking about rangers versus like thieves, because fantasy has this strong tradition of like the nobility of thieves and the Thieves Guild, where a thief is an honorable profession. Like, you have to steal from people, but there's rules, like you only do them this way. Is there an appeal to fantasy societies where you can have an authority that is acknowledged to be evil, and therefore living around the edges of it is something positive, is something, viewed as good?
You just stole my idea.
I mean, honestly, living in a world where the authority is an acknowledged evil is not something that's a big stretch for most of us these days. So,
Which happens. There is some appeal there. It's ironic. Now you're making it seem ironic that I don't like magic, because basically the appeal there is that your skill is what matters. It's not that you're the biggest person, which is why I tend to not like the fighter and the warrior types. But it's your skill means everything, which also sort of applies to mages. But having that energy source that we call magic, that gives them a bit of an advantage. Whereas, the rangers and the thieves, it's all their own skills.
yeah, interestingly, not to go on about my own books, but in my books and many others, there are lots of politics around magic, and in fact, the magician who is the most skilled is not always the one who is the most revered one or the most powerful one or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep asking about this. It's not just, again, this whole idea of the ranger, the outsider, comes back to kind of questions of morality. Like, is it necessarily bad to be outside of a society or to live on the edges of a society? And I don't think the society has to be like the evil king ruling all and the virtuous ranger living in the forest and basically your Robin Hood story. But there's also an idea of freedom that's very appealing, where, as you're saying, you live based on your own merits and not according to, you don't have to live in town and be beholden to all the rules of the town and the people who say you can't build your cottage above a certain height or, have unmown grass in your yard or anything like that. The neighborhood watch associations in fantasy towns are really draconian.
But you can outrun them since they all took an arrow to the knee. Yeah.
That was a joke based on your mascot.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That is one of the things with the fantasy world is you have that freedom. Whereas, going back to Elder Scrolls, you can steal everything that's not nailed down.
You just have to cover the shopkeeper's head.
Exactly.
There's no fun in that.
Although
So one of the things so another genre that brings to mind is the Western, because Westerns, like many fantasy worlds, have those big spaces at the edges where you can just make your own way and make your own rules. And in a sense, going back to morality is my thing about fantasy, it is very much you trust the individual to be a good person.
yeah. The concept of the outlaw, of course. Yeah, that is another genre that takes a lot of somewhat fantasy influences in terms of dealing with morality. Oh, what else have we got about morality?
Sorry, my phone was super buzzing and I was wondering if it was Christy, but it is not.
Oh no.
So yeah, I do want to make a mention of there's a book by Farrah Mendlesohn about fantasy that breaks fantasies into 4 categories. So I wanted to sort of mention that at least as a way of thinking about different fantasies, because each of them has kind of, it's useful to classify them because each of them has a different way or different kind of story that they tell.
Could I get the name again, please?
Farrah Mendlesohn.
Okay.
I've been trying to think of the name all morning because I knew I would need it, but then I didn't actually go look it up.
Very fantasy-like sounding name.
Yes.
Rhetorics
Rhetorics
of Fantasy.
of Fantasy, there you go. Thank you. And she talks about the four main kinds of fantasies, and obviously there are some that exist between these spaces and some that combine genres, whatever, but the primary categories are portal fantasies, which are a stranger coming into a new fantasy world. And a lot of those tend to be about exploration and disruption, like the stranger is bringing some new element into this fantasy world, but the stranger almost always has a guide who belongs to the world, who leads them through it, leads them around it, and so it's about learning a new way of life, and also potentially the stranger is disrupting the world, but those are more commonly intrusion fantasies, in which something from a fantasy world comes into our world and disrupts our world, and so that is more about recognizing the stranger, how we deal with strangers in our society, what it's like to be different, how we treat differences, and so on. There are immersion fantasies, and immersion fantasies are what we also call secondary world fantasies, which take place entirely in another fantasy world. Lord of the Rings is an emergent fantasy with characteristics of a portal because it's about Frodo leaving his little world and kind of going out into the larger world of Middle-earth. So there's aspects of a portal fantasy even though it's a complete secondary world. And the emergent fantasies are often about these morality questions of, the society is grappling with these larger issues of good and evil. And the last one are liminal fantasies, which contains things like magical realism, takes place in our world, but magical, kind of. Things like the movie Amelie is a really good example of that. I'm trying to think if there's been a more recent example, but that's the one I go back to when I think of magical realism.
Death Note?
Which,
Death Note, the manga anime film series about, there are Japanese Shinigami who have magical notebooks that can kill people, and one of them comes into our world, and a guy uses it to essentially take over the world.
that sounds like maybe more intrusion, but yes, a lot of anime are liminal fantasies because they take place nominally in our world, but also there are monsters.
Constantine.
Yeah, Constantine, Supernatural, stuff like that. And so those are like the four categories, and it's useful to think of stories in certain ways because they have beats and elements and themes, and when you are trying to write a story in a specific way, it's useful to know what kind of story you're writing and what kind of themes you're going to deal with. So I wanted to mention those and get those out because we're talking about writing fantasy, and those are very useful designations to know and be able to talk about. We are sort of running up around halfway, so if you guys have questions, this would be a great time to start asking questions. In the back?
Okay, can I recommend a pair of fantasy novels I read recently and liked? Yeah, I don't usually read the genre, but I did enjoy Six of Crows and its sequel, Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo.
Oh yeah, Leigh Bardugo's great.
Yeah, and I was attracted to the first one because I read a review that talked about how it compared, how it combined the fantasy setting with a heist storyline. Yeah, the heroes are a gang of criminals who we're still rooting for because they're better than most of the people in their world, and they have to steal something for an evil rich person, and they're all really well-developed characters who you sympathize with, and yeah, I would recommend those books to anyone who wants good fantasy and is not the standard Tolkien or Robert Howard type thing.
Yeah, I haven't read those. I've read a prior trilogy by Leigh that I cannot now remember the name of, but they were also really good.
Yeah, I think these are set in the same world.
Yeah, I think she goes back to that world. Bardugo, B-A-R-D-U-G-O is the last name of the author. I'm comfortable pretty much recommending anything, but that idea of this goes back to your thing, the band of criminals that are more virtuous than the society that they're technically criminals against is a great story for fantasy because it goes back to this whole, like, what makes a good person, what makes for a good person.
Can I get the book series again?
Sorry, what were the two books again?
Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom.
Six of Pearls?
Crows. Crows.
Crows.
C-O, yeah, so they're kind of furry characters. C-R-O-W-S, because they sort of identify with the crow as a symbol of their gang.
Is this like a trilogy in progress? Are these like the most recent things she's done?
Well, they're the most recent as far as I know.
Okay.
And as far as I can tell, it's only 2 books, although, the second, it doesn't technically end on a cliffhanger, but it does leave some things unresolved. So I really hope there will be another book.
So probably a trilogy in progress. That type of book tends to run in trilogies at this stage.
Yeah.
TJ?
Yeah, I'll admit, especially after a certain world building panel I attended, I've had an interest in writing fantasy, but I don't have those ideas. It's just not my normal wheelhouse. Contemporary usually is. Are there any places you recommend finding prompts to try to get that, start stretching out those muscles?
There's a topic that comes up again, now and again, which is, should you read things within the genre you're trying to write? And there are some people who say, no, you shouldn't read things because then it will pollute your mind with ideas that aren't yours, and then you will be accused of plagiarism, and everything will come crashing down, and it'll be terrible, and ruin and destruction. I personally think that you should read within the genre, because honestly, part of being in a writing community is being part of a discourse that's going on. And there's a tradition which still goes on of people writing books and people writing stories and books in response to those stories and books. And so if you're going to be part of the conversation, you need to have listened to the conversation up to that point. You can't just jump in with your, I read Lord of the Rings and I've seen the Hobbit movies, and now I'm going to write a fantasy book. One thing that I would recommend is seek out non-Western fantasies. We are all super familiar with Lord of the Rings at this point, I would imagine. If you haven't read the books, then you've seen the movies, or you've heard about the movies, or you know the story. Elves and dwarves and dragons and all that. Nothing against dragons. I know some very nice dragons, but there's so many more interesting settings and possibilities for fantasy, and mainstream fantasy right now is really encouraging that growth into those other areas. And I would say take a look at the last couple years of the World Fantasy Award. It's not perfect by any means. Awards are all biased based on who's picking them and who's valuing what and so on. But look at some of those lists and look at, I think especially there's a lot of really exciting fantasy coming out of the YA markets at this time. And specifically in the furry world, if you go down to the Sofa Wolf and Fur Planet tables and say, hey, what's a good non-traditional fantasy, they will probably be able to point you to something. But reading, or pick up a year's best fantasy anthology and just look at the short stories and things that people are writing, and the more you read, the more that'll spark ideas for other things that you could do. Any thoughts?
But he and I have probably had this discussion already, but basically I agree completely. I think most things I start with, what would this look like if I did it? Even if it ends up completely unrecognizable from whatever sparked the idea. That's how most things start with me.
If I can also suggest, if you want to spark an idea for a fantasy story, but you don't want to possibly pollute with, I'm reading stuff in the same genre. Art, if you can find fantasy art, you get an image, you can sort of what would be the story behind this weird crystal castle with the dragon coming down the stairway with something on back?
Or knights or knights on a cliff overlooking at a castle. It's just it's like the end of this or the beginning of this journey. That's the question.
I do think art serves as good inspiration. I think if you're looking for ways to frame a story around it, then seeing what people are doing with stories is an important part of that as well. But just for elements, art can be a fantastic inspiration. Are you guys all offering more advice?
No question. I have questions.
I have questions.
Okay.
What's your best thoughts on the best way to keep, have magic still be interesting, but not also be a MacGuffin?
Have magic be interesting, but not be a MacGuffin.
it completely. No. It has to have a cost, basically. I think the magic systems that appeal to me very much are, this is an energy source. You can use it, but there's a price. Even if that price isn't always clear, or what you can do with it isn't always clear. That's, I think, the best way to keep magic from being the MacGuffin, at least for me personally.
Yes, Christy did finally telegram and say that she's actually not able to make it here this morning. So having magic not be just a MacGuffin, I think spend a little time thinking about what interests you about magic. Is it, for a lot of people, magic is basically treated like guns, where it's an element beyond the purely physical that anyone can acquire that gives them an extra amount of power over someone else in offensive or defensive way. If you're treating it that way, think about how guns change the balance of power in society and also how they don't. I've had discussions with people about this where you would say, well, you would think that if anyone can pick up and buy a gun, we wouldn't have class structures anymore because everyone has the power to, threaten each other if they want. But in reality, those powers end up being controlled. There's rules laid down about them. There are people who control lots of them. There are people who control the people who have them. And there's all these politics that go into it. You can think of magic as a limited resource, and then how do people fight for access to it? But think about why does magic interest you? And then make your story revolve around those themes. You had a question. He had his hand up, and then I'll get over to you.
So could you possibly expound on non-magical items and or contraptions in a fantasy setting? Because that's not something that's extremely common, because it's much easier to fall back on magic.
Yeah, so non-magical items and contraptions makes me think immediately of steampunk, right?
Yes.
I mainly thought of kobolds, with how they do their ingenious traps without any magic.
Yeah. I know, you're the non-magical one. You want to talk about non-magical items?
No, because that's the one thing I actually do give them. It's like, we don't use magic, but we'll use magical items. Sorry. That is a good one, because it's just, your average everyday item.
I guess the question is, how special can these items be before they actually become magic?
Very. If you look to the real world, thinking about sword masters, that was one of the points the editor was making, was swords are special. They have names, they have histories that often can go beyond the person who was actually using them at the time. So these items do have power. They don't necessarily have to have magic power. Going back to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien made a big deal about the names and legacies of things like swords, that I think only 2 of them actually were specified to be magical. So,
which one? and the real.
yes.
Did you have a more specific question, about how they're used, or just wanting us to talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, more or less how does your ranger or rogue use a crossbow to conquer a wizard shooting fireballs at him? And how do you approach using something that's a device versus using something that is a dangerous magical power?
That one is, again, going back to the skills. It's okay, I'm doing this dangerous thing. I know what they can do. I know what I can do. And then just going about having a plan to deal with it, basically, is what it boils down to. You know, get behind them, cause a distraction, make it so they can't concentrate to throw fireballs and that sort of thing. And then it's academic.
It's an element of strategy and thinking. Okay. Yeah.
Just adding thoughts to both of the questions, like with keeping magic from being a MacGuffin and the items, like one of the tricks I do with keeping magic to be a MacGuffin is always, it was along the topic of like a price to it, where some magic causes extreme fatigue on the people who use it. Like, you can only use so much magic before your body can't handle it anymore and you risk passing out. It's like a muscle. And another thing is, like, with elemental magic, water magic, for example, it's good with water. Water freezes when it gets cold. You can't use water magic when it's cold, when it's below a certain temperature, or one of the things that I do with one of my stories is one of my races are Thunderbirds, and they're at war with these people who have airships. People with airships have developed lightning rods which power their ships, which resist the Thunderbirds' lightning attacks, and they develop flamethrowers to disrupt the air.
So a lot of I think a lot of the things with using non-magical items in a magic or non-magical world is there's this reliance on using kind of brains to overpower brawn, even if the brawn is just magical brawn and not specifically physical. So I think that's where a lot of non-magical items come in. There's this idea that, especially in a magic world, you're like, oh, I've invented this like special kind of crossbow that can fire from a much longer distance than is the range of the wizard's fireball spell, and so therefore I have the advantage because my ingenuity has come up with this solution rather than just, you know, lighting things on fire.
Yeah.
So there's that the element is, and this is like a recurring element in books, is that it's better to be smart than powerful. And I think those things play into that.
I guess, yeah, in a sense, as much as mundane as some of the stuff we're used to is, it still works as having a tinge along with magic, because, yeah, a mage is useless if they get sniped by a sniper.
Exactly, yeah. We have more hands up, yeah.
I wanted to suggest for the contraptions one, the Girl Genius series by the Folio pair. They did, that's sort of on the edges of both of magical technology.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, but also there's an element of the artifacts in there are a little bit magic, because the people who can make them have a special like magical ability to make them. But it's an interesting, it's very steampunky. It's very steampunk fusion of know-how, and they, a lot of times, he builds a lot on the idea that, well, you have this spark, but also you're really smart and you know what to do with it, and you have to have both of those qualities in order to be successful.
Yeah, and that's sort of the magic restriction that I've been working with. I work with roboticists. It's like we can make all sorts of great things, but is it worth the time to figure it out? And I did have a question. It was, what do you add or remove to make it a YA novel, to make it a YA book?
Oh man, that's like a whole panel. You remove grown-ups.
I think that's
really, honestly, one of the big hallmarks of a YA novel is the teenage protagonists cannot rely on grown-ups to solve their problems for them. The grown-ups are at best ineffective and at worst obstructive. And you may have the helpful grown-up, but the helpful grown-up is always the powerless one. Like the old grandmother who's like, well, I can't do anything anymore, but here's what we did back in my day. And the kids are like, yeah, we'll go do that. Or in the Harry Potter books, Dumbledore, who is, the most powerful wizard in the world, but can't actually help Harry with any of the problems Harry's dealing with.
There's a reason for it.
Yeah, there's just somebody else's problem field active around him.
Right. Well, that's the point. The point of the YA books is the kids have to solve their own problems, and part of that is, the grown-ups being ineffective is partly to force the kids to solve their own problems. It's also partly to give the target audience, young reader, this feeling of confidence that they can address things, and hey, I remember being a teenager and thinking about how stupid all the grown-ups were, and so reading a book like that, I was like, yeah, they are all dumb. But yeah, I don't know, do you have any
I
YA thoughts?
unfortunately don't have a lot of YA experience yet.
But yeah, there's a lot of things that go into YA books, but it's often a coming of age. So you have a teenager who takes responsibility for their life as the book goes on. There's a lot of things you can put into it, but the biggest element is it's a teenage, very young adult or very young adult protagonist who is faced with a situation that the grown-ups in their life are powerless to resolve, and they have to solve it. That's in a very compressed space what YA is.
Makes a lot of sense, thank you.
Yes?
I've been trying to think about how to word this question, but do you find it difficult, I guess, or is there a balance between using familiar themes and tropes and over-relying on those themes and tropes?
Tropes exist for a reason.
Yeah.
So it's because they've been proven to work. So you shouldn't be afraid to use them, but they are, at this point, just that, a starting point. Like I said, with taking stories, try and put your own spin on it, basically, is how I deal with it. And that's what editing is for, either yourself or others, is to see if you've gone too far into tropes.
Yeah, I would say I think that's an excellent way to put it. There's a starting point. You've got to bring your own ideas to it as well, and a lot of times that comes from taking ideas from other sources and saying, what if we did this trope, but then, what are the problems with that trope? Well, let me start with that and then write something that addresses these problems, or write something that goes off in a different direction and raises other questions. This is something I think that beta readers are very, very helpful with, because you can have come up with this fantastic story and you love it and you are convinced that it is the most original thing in the whole entire world, and your beta readers will look at it and say, this is exactly the same plot as that Fred Saberhagen book that you gave me to read 4 years ago. Did you not remember that? And you're like, oh no. Or they'll also say, or they might read your book and, so here's an example. There's a book by Naomi Novik called, I can see it on my shelf. It won awards like 2-3 years ago.
Uprooted?
Uprooted, thank you. And I was having a discussion with some other people about it, and I was like, oh, I really like this book, I like the characters, I liked all this stuff. And one of the other people was like, I wish that she hadn't included this trope of, you know, aging male wizard has young female protege, and they fall in love, and, you know, it's all, you know, he is the mentor in her life, and then they have this romantic relationship, and I was like, well, why not? And she's like, it's been done so many times.
It's very thin.
And I thought, and I was like, well, but she did it really well. And I'm like, oh, she did it really well, but I've seen it so much, and so many people have done it poorly, that just as soon as that relationship was set up, I was like teeth on edge and like, no, 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 no. So that's something where, you know, if for whatever reason I were beta reading that book, I would have been like, this looks great. But if this other person were beta reading it, she would have been like, oh, can you do something about that relationship? Because this is like, so many people have done this in the past. So that's something where you may have, you know, you may not be aware of tropes that you're doing, and because another reason that tropes work well is because they're natural symbols or ideas that occur to lots of people, and it's possible for you to have this same idea based on the popular culture that we're all exposed to without knowing that 20 other people have also had this same idea. And it's not necessarily because you read all of their things and said, that's really cool, I want to do that too, but that the same forces that lead them to make these associations also led you to make the associations. It's just that they did it first, and so now you're kind of stuck. Yeah.
I had this idea for a fantasy series a few years ago, and it's still in the concept phase. And I told it to a friend, and he didn't like the idea of it being like originally the protagonists were from Earth and they came into this world. It's been like done so many times, and he suggested to make the world of origin be fantasy based. But it doesn't make sense to me, like putting a fantasy world within a fantasy world. Is there a way to actually make that work, or?
Sure.
I don't know. Really,
yes.
It just seems really redundant to me. Is that also redundant? Do you feel that that's also redundant?
Well, I mean, I'm now really amused at the idea of someone coming from a fantasy world into an identical fantasy world.
It's not identical. I know it's not identical.
But no, I'm amused at that idea. No, I think what you want to do, the idea of backing up, going back to the whole idea, is it a portal fantasy or an intrusion fantasy? What themes are you trying to explore by having someone come into one world from the other? What changes are you trying to examine? You don't have to tell me right now, but the idea is think about what themes you're trying to explore and then see how can I build two different worlds that would highlight that contrast, that would allow me to pull those themes out into my story. So actually, if you want an example, I'm not necessarily recommending the book, but an example of that is Cameron Hurley's Mirror Empire, which has two worlds that are kind of mirrors of each other but have developed along different lines, and then barriers break between them and people go back and forth. So you could potentially examine it that way.
Yeah, well actually it's more like the other world was a world created by this wizard, and then he abandoned it like after some time, and then the protagonists come up, because there are two protagonists in my book series coming from the original world into that world, and it's like in ruins, and there's like there's different races and whatnot.
Like I said, you don't have to. These are how you think about how to go ahead and do that. You don't have to like tell us all of them right now, but the way to think about it is to say, what did I want to highlight by having someone cross from this world into the other? What questions did I want to bring up? And then how can I build the worlds to allow me to highlight those questions?
It's meant to be utopia, the second world.
Okay. All the way in the back?
It's all right. Never mind.
You sure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. At what point would you say is a magic system too excessive or too developed, or is there a limit? because in a lot of instances when I'm writing, I tend to make it as close to a science as possible, and as a limiting factor. So or as and considering accessibility, then anyone would be able to supposedly do anything else because, say, destructive particle interference or something. So
you're the one who hates magic. Tell him what's wrong with his magic system.
Okay.
Actually, it seems like you're doing fine as long as you have it being as long as you have a limit, you should be okay.
Right, like limits of science and stuff like that. But what point would you say is at what point would you say is it too much to go into detail in in one story? Is it possible to what would you say would be an ideal threshold of magic exploration relative to anything else?
That's going to depend on your story. You need to give the reader enough details that they can grasp the story. If you end up giving more details than are necessary for the story to get its point across, then you're over-explaining it. But there is no, I can't tell you one paragraph of magic explanation per 2,000 words of story is the exact right amount, because I don't know what your story's about. I don't know how closely the magic system plays into it. That's something that you have to judge. And again, toss your story over to beta readers and ask people like, hey, is there a point where you think I could leave out stuff, or are there points where you're confused because I'm not explaining stuff well enough? And eventually the more you write things, the more of a feel that you'll get for how much is necessary for someone to get the story.
Here.
Okay, so there is sort of a common theme in fantasy of, and even the real world, of the people in the countryside, the farmers are the real people, and people in the cities are, bad or elitist or wicked or something like that. How do you think that plays into the earlier discussion about you like your rogue, you like your rangers being on the edge? Either one of you.
I don't have rogues or rangers, so that was clearly meant for him.
You could also go offline with that. I have a backup question.
I guess it sort of fits in, because again, those are people that the trope there is that, oh, the farmers are living on their own skill, whereas the sort of the view of the people in the city is they're just freeloading off of someone else's efforts. Which, not necessarily true, but that's kind of...
So your fantasy stories are communist, is what you're saying?
Maybe a little. What else?
Oh, okay, right here.
What would you say makes a... Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to phrase it. What would you say makes a character interesting or compelling? Like, I write stuff, but I often find that eventually my characters will kind of become bland or like resolve things too quickly.
What makes a character interesting and compelling? One of the things that I always go back to in terms of getting characters through a story is have there be something that they want that's really important to them. The more you can convey things that are important to your characters and why they're important to your characters, the more interesting and compelling they are. Also making well-rounded characters. So you don't just have the the thief, and his role in the story is to steal things when the party needs him to steal things, and when people say, hey, why are you a thief? He goes, because I steal things. Maybe he's a thief who also like breeds rabbits at home, and so he has pet rabbits, and why does he like rabbits? And as a result of having pet rabbits, he hates hawks because they steal his rabbits, and so anytime he sees a hawk, he like shoots at it. Little quirks like that. Think about all the varied interests your characters could have. Think about the thing that having them have something that they really want is what's going to keep the reader engaged in what happens to them. Giving them a lot of other interests in their life gives the reader something else to latch onto and remember about them.
Everything that's coming to my mind I got from you, at least indirectly, so. I'm remembering your theory of the ghost, the want, and the need.
Right. Yeah, that's all also story theory, which isn't technically pertinent to this panel, and we're like 2 minutes from the next panel, and we still have like a couple hands up, so.
Okay.
But basically that's, yeah.
This goes to 11:30. This goes to 11:30.
Really?
Yeah.
Yep. I think it does, because besides you've got a third of the next panel here, so, yeah.
Yeah, it's until 11:30.
All right. Not that I'm doubting you. But, oh yeah, we do. All right, cool, we have another half hour. Yeah, so yeah, the whole idea of the ghost, the want, and the need with characters. The ghost is the thing that happened in their past that kind of shapes who they are now, what they want and need. The want is the tangible thing that they're chasing in the story. The need is the way that the lesson they have to learn, or the thing their character has to do in order to grow as a person over the course of the story, which they may not be aware of, but you should always be aware of. You have to know those for the main character. Probably, if you have an adversary, it's good to know them for the main adversary. You don't have to know them for all the characters, but if you're having trouble with one of your characters just being kind of bland, it's a good exercise to go back and say, well, what if this character was the main character in a story? What would their motivation be? Why would they be in this story at all? Are they just here to hang out and steal things for the protagonist? What do they get out of it?
I do actually have one thing to put on this. I've been writing for quite a long time, and one thing which I've always figured out was definitely making characters a little interesting is give them some sort of flaw. No one's perfect. And for example, I'm writing a trilogy right now. The main character, she's been bruised and battered all the time. She has issues. And while you don't have to make these things so prevalent, but even a simple flaw is, for example, the world is a hectic place. There's a lot of fighting, stuff like that, and having it in your band of characters is always in fights. But then you have some characters who can't fight. That's even a flaw simple as that tends to seem to help, in my experience. Yeah, flaws.
Yeah.
So going back to when you were doing your most recent novels, you're developing your magic system. Was it a case of you sat out beforehand and went through sort of the world building in your head of how the magic was going to work, or was it you were writing and got sort of a little bit in and said, oh, I maybe need to think about this a little more, and like then sort of started fleshing it out?
I mean, yes. Kind of both. Okay. No, I started out thinking about magic and how people like to classify things, and so I did the thing you do in Magic World where you're like, there's 4 categories of magic spells and they fall into these things, and then I thought, well, what would be the 4 categories? And there's obviously spells that combine one or more of the categories, and I thought classifying them, putting them into those categories makes it easier to say, oh, I want to do this kind of thing. Oh, that falls under this category, and you do it this way. And then it's kind of thinking, putting yourself in the shoes of people and thinking, what kinds of things would I want to do with magic? And that was a very iterative process, because I would have a lot of spells written down, and then I would go through the book, and people would be doing things, and I would think, well, why aren't they doing this with magic? And there would either be a reason for that, or I would have to invent a new spell. So one of the things that I do, and I'm going back to the Broken Earth trilogy, Nora Jemison's books. One of the things that she does really well in there that I've kind of tried to emulate is she builds out the world gradually. So you start off with, here's a person who can affect the movement of the earth. Like there's the first book is called The Fifth Season, because periodically on this world there are huge planetary level like tectonic events that disrupt weather patterns and everything, and people refer to those as fifth seasons. And so the book starts with one of those things happening, and one of the main characters stabilizes her village so that they don't get lost, but that stabilization marks her as someone who has this kind of power, which she knows means she can't stay in the village anymore. And so that's your first exposure. It's like, oh, someone can like affect this power. And you explore the ramifications of that for a good section, and then you kind of get into, you meet this other main character who is part of a little creche of kids who all have these powers and are being raised, and then you see other things they can do with those powers. And then that's explored for a while, and then in the third section of the book, you start to see, oh, when people are really highly trained, here's these other things that they can do with these powers. And so by the end of the book, you've got this much more complex magic system than just I can stop earthquakes, start or stop earthquakes, and you've got much more, but you've had time to absorb it all and build it up, and she didn't just throw at you in the very beginning, oh, here's people who can do this, and they can throw these things around, and they can do this, and they can make it cold, or they can make it warm, or they can whatever. And so I'm trying to do that, and it's a little bit of a cop-out to do it in the context of someone learning magic at school, because they start with the really simple stuff and then they learn the complex stuff. So you start learning the complicated stuff, and but he's not learning it fast enough. So in the second book, he goes and meets other people who have different kinds of magic, and you learn about different and more nefarious things that people can do with magic. More questions?
So let's say there's a call for submissions that you think you actually have something going with your Wheelhouse fan fiction. How would you actually finagle that story to fit the call without it actually, getting in trouble?
He's looking at me for a very specific reason, and we'll just leave it at that. Basically, it's knowing how to file the serial numbers off it. It's a good place to start, but you do have to take it and make it so it is yours. Fan fiction type things are an inspiration. When you go to publication, you do have to make it your own world, basically, is the most simple thing. So again, those tropes, you're using tropes as a start, and then you jump off from there.
Yeah, it's rename all the characters, add a couple distinctive elements of your own, change the setting, I'm trying to think of what the 50 Shades of Grey author did to the Twilight books.
Don't have your main character be Snagglepuss.
Yeah. But yeah, I think if you can introduce an element of your own into the world, at least like one or two distinctive elements, that goes a long way towards making it more distinctively yours. Anything else? Yes, sorry.
It's been an interesting concept that I'd seen, that I haven't seen a whole lot of, from a perspective of, instead of having an explicit limitation on magic from outside the universe, for instance, this is just how it works and that's how you're building a magical system. Having an implicit limitation in the universe, for instance, there's only so much magic in the world and some kind of authority has to regulate it so that people who actually use magic, there's enough of them to use it, or it's spread so thin because there's so many people, some apocalyptic event happens and suddenly everyone's starting to realize, wait, there's magic in this world and it can actually happen. And working with something like that versus having an outside.
That sounds cool, you should write that.
There's something like that written along that lines, it's called Riffs.
By?
It's actually an RPG's world where it's of Earth, and then there's a cataclysm event that happened on a certain day at a certain place, and all of a sudden the ley lines flare up and there's magic all over the world now, along with monsters, portals.
I was going to say another recommendation for people who are interested in magic and magic systems and so on is the Lev Grossman's The Magicians. I've read the first book and enjoyed it. I have not read the next two, but I have watched all 3 seasons of the TV series, and the second season is a little weak, but the TV series on the whole is very good. The first season is very good, the third season is great, and they deal with the ramifications of magic, and it's not always a good thing.
So I was on the sci-fi writing panel yesterday, and one of the things that we pointed out was, sci-fi has a tradition of cat people, and you can have very furry type races in mainstream science fiction, and it sort of integrates very well and it's easy to sort of blend lines. How do you feel that way about fantasy, or is there any particular challenge to incorporating your furries into fantasy or something like that?
So funny story. I had a story rejected by a mainstream science fiction publication with a personal rejection and the editor's note where they said, "We liked the story, but apart from the fact that everyone is animal people, there wasn't a strong spec-fic element to it." So yeah, that story, by the way, was published in Roar 8 and won an award last night. So, ooh. Don't be discouraged by rejections is the point. Yeah, fantasy, you would think there would be way more room for furries, and it feels like they're more common in science fiction. I've just been reading Dan Simmons' Hyperion books, which are modern classics and have furries in them. And Kim Stanley Robinson's 2312, which is a fabulous far future novel, has furries in it. Science fiction is starting to realize, or has realized for a while, but also is starting to be more common to realize that when body modification and transhumanism are big themes in science fiction, and they're starting to realize like transhumanism doesn't just mean cyborgs, it also means furries, which is pretty cool. Fantasy, you get like animal people, but they tend to have to be sort of the indigenous people of a fantasy world in order for that to happen, and that's, yeah, werewolf, kind of, I mean, shapeshifters, yes. Shapeshifters are also part of fantasy. They're like a different branch, but yeah, I'm thinking of like Secondary World and other fantasies. But yeah, urban fantasies have a lot of furries. I'm sorry, what?
Elder Scrolls.
Oh, yes.
I'd have to let you talk to that. I haven't played those games.
Yeah,
But I know they have furry species in them.
Yeah, they have indigenous furry species, and then of course there's the big thing that pops up in fantasy all the time. You have dragons everywhere.
That's true.
And they shake their sexy tails everywhere.
Dragons have evolved over the years from monsters to player characters.
Case in point.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think it's something that is changing, and I really enjoy reading like furry fantasies because it's neat to have animal people with those elements. It's still something that feels a little bit new to me because it's not that common in the mainstream. Especially if we're talking like sword and sorcery fantasies. When we're going, urban fantasies have werewolves, but I think are only just starting to become more imaginative with their shifters. There's a whole genre of shifter romance also, which also might be titled the bad pun titles of genre romance. There's one, I forget, it's like Taken by Swarm or something, where the protagonist falls in love with someone who can transform into a hive of bees. So weird. But yeah, if you want terrible animal pun titles, go for the shifter romances. They're all out there.
I suddenly have questions that I don't want answered.
No, really don't. Yeah.
What would you consider to be, say, the barrier between when something is fantasy and when something is sci-fi? I've only really heard of one situation of video game series of sorts that's kind of right on the barrier between the two. When you look at it visually, it seems fantasy. You have swords, you have magic. The main group there can create life out of basically essence, and you have dragons and that sort of stuff. But then when you look into it, it's a very scientific base. The life they're creating, they're going through DNA and altering it to make what they need. Later on, they figure out, oh, we have DNA, we can use it to alter our own bodies. And it turns into a story which is a combination of transhumanism on one side and what is effectively an AI uprising on the other. It has a foot in both worlds. Visually and setting-wise, it feels very fantasy, but thematically and story-wise, it's very sci-fi. Where would that barrier be? Is that right on the barrier? Is it sci-fi? Is it fantasy? What kind of thing would that be?
So this goes back to when I was talking about right at the beginning of the panel, when I was talking about like the Dragon Riders of Kern and the Broken Earth series, which are both technically, the authors classify them, I think, as science fiction, although actually I think Jemison talks about hers being also fantasy, or just being fantasy, just with science elements. But Anne McCaffrey used to say for a while that the Dragon Riders of Kern was science fiction, because the people there were colonists sent there in rocket ships, and they colonized this planet. But it's a story about people who live in volcanoes and ride dragons, and that's a fantasy. So I tend to look at the themes of the story, the elements and the underpinnings of the story. Is it about society's change in response to new ideas or new technology? Or is it about like larger questions of community and movements and so on? the latter tend to be fantasy, the former tend to be science fiction. It's also very, very possible to have something that doesn't fit neatly into either genre. Humans love to slap labels on things, but there's always things that fall in between the labels. David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas is maybe science fiction, but also kind of fantasy. Bone Clocks, same thing. And maybe they're just good literary stories. He famously does not like to label his stories as being part of any genre. So, yeah, maybe they, the larger question might be, why does a thing have to be labeled one or the other? So it's easy for you to find it in the bookstore, because it's not really a thing people do very much anymore.
The main thing I remember the creator saying about that was he wanted to make a sci-fi story, he started doing it, then realized sci-fi games aren't really selling, I'm going to make it with fantasy instead. So he did.
Right, so that it can be sold under the fantasy label, which is where everyone was looking for their games at that point. Yeah. So, yeah. Do you have thoughts on that?
I think you pretty well covered it.
Anyone else? 10 minutes. Do you have any recommendations for people to leave them with at the end of our panel?
Well, for fantasy, always start with the classics. There's Tolkien. As I use him now, he's my book to fall asleep with. But he gives you at least an overview, since that's pretty much where modern fantasy started. And I will throw it to you for more off the beaten track things.
And I'm trying to think of stuff that I've read recently that I really liked. Again, I already mentioned the Broken Earth series, N.K. Jemisin. They're terrific. Naomi Novik's Uprooted was another. I liked it a lot. If you're tired of the old man and young woman romantic trope, then you may not want to read it, but I enjoyed it a lot. What else have I read recently? I think a lot of what I've been reading recently has just been science fiction. Yeah, I don't know. So there's a novella that was out last year, which is nominated for awards this year, which is why I'm reading it. Which is again science fiction, but also but has fantasy elements. By Sarah Pinsker, called "And Then There Were N-1," which is basically about a woman being invited to a convention of all the different instances of herself from across the multiverse. And so Sarah Pinsker goes to the Sarah Pinsker convention, where all the Sarah Pinskers from all over the different multiverses show up. And so it's a science fiction-y thing based in science fiction, but it's also kind of a fantasy story. And then there's a murder, which is really interesting when she has to try to imagine, under what circumstances would I murder someone, and why would I murder myself in those circumstances? It's a very interesting little novella. It's very well done. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. She does a good job of it. But man, fantasy, I don't know that I've read any other really good fantasy recently. The Jemisin and the Novik books are the ones that really spring to mind. I do have one for you. Kij Johnson has been writing fan fiction, kind of to your point, but more like homages to original works. So she has recently written a sort of sequel to The Wind in the Willows, which I have not yet read, but she also wrote a sequel to H.P. Lovecraft's Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath called The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, which is fantastic. It's great. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is a weird Lovecraft book in that it's basically the travels of this guy, Randall Carter, is that his name? Something like that? Through this world that he falls into in a dream, sort of in a dream, maybe, we're not sure. And he kind of encounters elder gods, but in most Lovecraft stories, the elder gods are the ones that come down and just like wreck your mind, and he manages to not quite have that happen. And there's kind of horrific things that happen, but it's not in the same way that they usually do in Lovecraft. So it's a really interesting one, and what kids loved the book growing up and didn't realize until later that there were no female characters in it, and that Lovecraft, because he's Lovecraft, talks about these other kinds of people in the book, like the devious merchants with the slanted eyes that you can't trust, and the people who, it's just all, it's like, it's Lovecraft. So she decided she was going to write a story about Kadath where there were all these other people who were just people, and there were lots of women in the story, and it's really cool. It works really well. I read Dream Quest before I read her follow-up, and it's really interesting. And then but I have so much trouble reading Lovecraft these days.
Yeah.
Because he's just so terrible and so like, it's like, so like I taste cilantro as soap, and I feel like reading Lovecraft now with that awareness is like if you were able to enjoy cilantro up to a point and then suddenly it started tasting bad, and now every time you eat it you're just like, oh, this is, oh no. So yeah.
So as a jump off from that, that's right, Jid. I'm a polar scientist, and I know what is in Antarctica. Lovecraft clearly, when he wrote his stories, did not. And so I can't read At the Mountains of Madness because I read it and I go, it's not there. I know it's not there.
You just didn't see it properly.
Yeah.
All right. If you guys don't have anything else, I think we're close enough to the end that we can reasonably flee the room now.
But you can.
Oh, are you here for the next panel also? Oh my gosh. All right. Well, I will get out of your way. If you guys want to chat further about fantasy, I'll be down in the dealer room for a couple hours. I also have books down there. Do you have anything down there that is out?
Yes, I have down in Heat 15 at Sulphur Wolf, and Fang 8 and Dogs of War 2 at Fur Planet.
Buy their books.
Thank you guys for your attention and attendance. I always expect to come in at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning of a con and see like 3 people, so this was awesome. Thank you.